She's soft where the crown needs iron. Your sister will make the better Luna, and we both know it." The words slid out of Kaelin's mouth like they cost him nothing, and somewhere behind the study door where she stood frozen, Seraphine Voss felt the mate bond in her chest tear like wet paper. It was a physical thing, that snap, a cold that started at her sternum and spread outward until her fingertips went numb against the carved wood. She had come to bring him tea because he'd been up half the night reviewing the Northern Territory maps, because that was the kind of thing she did, the small tending, the quiet devotion. And now she stood in the dark hallway of Blackmere Hold, holding a tray that had begun to shake, listening to the male the moon had chosen for her explain to his war second exactly why he intended to give her sister the title that had been promised to her since childhood. She did not scream. That was the first choice she made, and it surprised her that she was capable of making it. Every instinct in her wolf howled to throw open the door, to demand he look her in the eyes and say it again, to let him see what the words had done to her face. But she pressed her lips together until they went white, and she breathed through her nose, and she listened, because pain that has nowhere to go turns into information if you let it. So she let it. She stood in the shadow of the tapestry that showed the founding of the Ashfan pack, and she gathered every syllable like a woman collecting stones to weigh her own drowning. "The alliance with the river packs matters more than sentiment," Kaelin went on, and she could hear the creak of his chair as he leaned back, comfortable, unhurried, a king discussing furniture. Lysandra photographs like a queen. She smiles and the elders melt. Seraphine. And here he paused, and the pause was worse than anything he could have said. Seraphine runs the accounts and remembers everyone's birthday. That's a steward, not a Luna. A steward, not a Luna. She had spent 11 years learning the treaties that kept Blackmere from war. She had rebuilt the pack's finances from the smoking ruin his father left. She had sat up through 3 plague winters distributing medicine with her own hands, and he had reduced all of it to a woman who remembers birthdays. The tray stopped shaking. That was the strange part. The moment the insult landed fully, her hands went perfectly still, because a decision had been made somewhere below language, in the old animal part of her that knew when a place was no longer safe. "And she knows?" the war second asked. Torvald, his name was, a slab of a man loyal to Kaelin since their boyhood, and even he sounded uneasy. "Seraphine. She's carried the promise since she was a girl. The whole pack expects it at the solstice. She'll understand. She always understands." Kaelin said it like a compliment, like her endless capacity to swallow disappointment was a feature he had come to rely upon, a well he could keep drawing from because it never ran dry. "I'll speak to her after the crowning is announced. She won't make a scene. It isn't in her." He was right, in a way that made her want to laugh and made her want to be sick in equal measure. She would not make a scene. But he had mistaken the reason. He thought her silence was softness. He did not understand that some silences are the sound of a door closing so quietly that by the time you hear the lock turn, the person on the other side is already gone. She backed away from the door. She set the tray on the console table beneath the tapestry, arranged it neatly, the cup, the small pot, the sprig of mint she'd cut from the kitchen garden because he liked mint, because she had always noticed what he liked. She looked at it for a moment, that little offering, and then she turned and walked down the corridor with her spine straight and her steps even, past the portraits of the Blackmere alphas, past the great doors carved with the running wolf, out into the cold blue of the pre-dawn courtyard, where the frost had silvered the flagstones, and her breath hung in the air like something she was leaving behind. The bond still ached. It would ache for a long time. She understood that already, the way you understand that a burn will blister before it does. Kaelan had never fully claimed her, never spoken the final vows, and now she knew why. He had been keeping his options open the whole time, letting her build his kingdom, while he decided whether she was worthy of the crown that ran it. The bond between them had been real on her side. That was the humiliation that would take longest to heal. She had loved a man who had been auditioning her. Above her the last stars were fading, and the eastern sky had gone the pale grey of ash. She had until dawn, she calculated, before the household stirred, before Lysandra swept down the stairs in one of her bright dresses to be admired at breakfast, before Kaelan appeared with his easy smile, and his hand that would land on her shoulder like she was a favoured hound. She had until dawn to decide what kind of woman she was going to be, and standing there in the frost, watching her breath disappear, Seraphine made the only decision that mattered. She was not going to be the steward who understood. She was going to be the thing he never saw coming. She looked up at the fading stars, and she made herself a promise, quiet as the closing door. He wanted iron for his crown. She would go and become iron somewhere he could not reach, and one day he would come asking, and she would be the one who decided whether to answer. She went to her rooms, and she did not turn on the lamp. Moving in the dark had never troubled her. She had spent enough sleepless nights in these chambers learning the exact geography of them, the loose board by the hearth, the wardrobe that stuck unless you lifted as you pulled. She knelt at the foot of her bed and drew out the travelling case she had packed, unpacked, and repacked a dozen times over the past 2 years, always telling herself it was only sensible, only prudent, that a woman who managed a pack's survival ought to be ready to run if the mountain came down. She had never admitted to herself what she was really rehearsing. Now she knew. Some part of her had been preparing for this dawn since long before she had a reason. Inside the case were things that belonged to her and to no one else. Clothes that were plain and durable, not the fine gowns Kaelan liked to see her in at the high table. A set of ledgers, copied in her own hand, that contained the true financial architecture of Blackmere Hold, every debt owed to it, and every debt it owed, information she had assembled over 11 years, and which existed nowhere else in the world in such complete form. A small leather purse of coins, gold she had saved quietly from her own steward's stipend, never touching the household accounts, so that not a single copper in it could be called stolen. And beneath a false panel in the lid, a folded document sealed with wax she had melted and pressed herself, a thing she had drawn up on a night 2 winters ago, when the loneliness had gotten so bad she needed to imagine a version of her life that was hers alone. She did not put on the ring. That was the second choice. Kaelan had given her a ring the summer they turned 18, a promise ring, a heavy band of northern silver set with a moonstone, and she had worn it every day since, as though it were a vow rather than a leash. She took it off now, and she set it on her pillow, in the center, where the maid would find it, and where he would understand. She did not leave a note. A note would have been begging in a different alphabet, and she was finished begging. The ring said everything. I know, I heard. I am gone. There was money in the household strong box she could have taken, and she had every moral right to it, having earned it 100 times over. She took none. Whatever she built now, she would be able to say it had come from nothing he gave her. That mattered more than gold. Let him tally the accounts after she was gone, and find that the steward who supposedly loved him had left with less than she came in with. Let that be the thing he could never quite explain to himself in the years ahead. She closed the case and buckled it, and she moved through the sleeping hold like a ghost who already belonged to another life. There was one person she needed to see before she went, and she found the old woman awake, as she had known she would be, because Maeve Ordain had not slept a full night in 40 years, not since the fever that took her mate and her sons in the same terrible spring. Maeve kept the herb stores and the birthing records, and the memory of the pack in her narrow bones, and she looked up from her work table when Seraphine slipped through the low door, and her clouded eyes went sharp with understanding before a word was spoken. "So," Maeve said, "he's done it then. The thing I smelled coming on him for a year. You knew? I know the smell of a man about to choose the shiny thing over the true thing. I've buried enough of them." She set down the pestle she'd been holding. "You're leaving. Before dawn?" The old woman nodded slowly, and there was grief in it, but no argument, and Seraphine loved her fiercely in that moment for not trying to talk her into staying, for not offering the poison of reasonable hope. Maeve rose on stiff legs and crossed to the corner and moved aside a basket of dried yarrow, and beneath it was a loose stone in the floor, and beneath that, wrapped in oilcloth, a small iron key. "The old smuggler's road," Maeve said, "runs under the east wall, comes out past the boundary in the birchwood. My mate used it in the bad years, moving people the last alpha wanted disappeared. Nobody living remembers it but me." She pressed the key into Seraphine's hand and closed the girl's cold fingers around it with her own warm ones. "You won't set off the wards. You'll be a mile gone before the sun's up." Seraphine's composure, which had held through everything, which had held through the study door and the ring on the pillow and the silent walk through the halls, cracked at last, just slightly, just enough for 2 tears to fall. "Come with me." "No, child. Someone has to stay and watch it rot. Someone has to be here to tell you when the time is right." The old woman's grip tightened. "And it will rot, Seraphine. What he's building on that pretty sister of yours will not hold. She's a mirror. A mirror can't lead. When it falls, and it will, you'll want to know. You leave me a way to reach you, and I'll be your eyes in this house until my last breath." They arranged it in low voices, a chain of trusted travelers and traders who passed through Blackmere and owed the old healer favors, a way for word to move. And then Maeve did something she hadn't done since Seraphine was a child with a scraped knee. She pulled the young woman into her arms and held her, and murmured into her hair, over and over, "You are the true thing. You are the true thing. You are the true thing," until Seraphine believed it enough to stand up straight again. Then she took her case and her key, and she went down into the dark under the east wall, into the smell of old earth and stone, and she walked toward a mouth of grey light a mile away. And she didn't look back, because looking back was a thing that belonged to the woman she used to be, and that woman had stayed behind on a pillow in the shape of a silver ring. She came out into the birchwood as the first true light touched the tops of the trees, and the air smelled of cold sap and last night's rain, and somewhere behind her, faint and thin across the distance, she heard the great bell of Blackmere Hold begin to ring for the morning. She stood in the birches and let it wash over her, that sound she had woken to for 11 years, and then she turned her back on it and started walking, and with each step the bell grew fainter, and by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, she could not hear it at all. The world outside the mountain remained entirely ignorant of what it had just lost. That was the thing about her kind of person, the steward, the one who remembers birthdays. Their leaving does not shake the walls. It is only later, when the accounts will not balance, and the treaties begin to fray, and the small tended things start dying one by one, that anyone thinks to ask where the hands went that had held it all together. By then it is too late. By then the hands are somewhere else, building something new and getting stronger, and learning at last exactly how much they were worth. She walked for 3 days along the trade road, sleeping in the lee of stone walls, and once in the loft of a shepherd's barn, spending her coins carefully, speaking to no one longer than she had to. On the 4th day, she reached the river Pax, and here is where a lesser woman might have made her mistake, might have gone straight to the river Alphas and offered her grievance and her knowledge as a weapon against Kaelin, might have tried to burn Blackmere down from the outside. Seraphine did not. She had thought about it for 3 days of walking, and she had understood something clean and hard. Revenge that came from bitterness would make her small. She did not want to make Kaelin suffer. She wanted to make herself so large that his choice looked like the mistake it was. And there is only one way to become large, and it is not by tearing others down. It is by building. So she did not go to the Alphas. She went to the docks. The river Pax were unlike the mountain Pax in ways that had always fascinated her from a distance in the treaties she had studied by candlelight. They were merchant wolves, traders and brokers and shippers, and their power came not from bloodlines and crowns, but from ledgers and contracts and the ceaseless movement of goods up and down the great water. A woman with no title meant nothing there, but a woman who could read a balance sheet at a glance and spot a fraud in a shipping manifest meant a great deal, and Seraphine could do both. She found work within a week, humble work, keeping accounts for a mid-sized trading house that dealt in salt and timber and dried fish, and she kept her head down and her name plain, calling herself only Sarah, letting them assume she was some minor Pax cast-off daughter, which was near enough to true. The house was called Rycroft, run by a widow named Ottoline Rycroft, who had inherited it from a husband who'd left it drowning in debt, and who ran it now with the ferocity of a woman who had learned the hard way that softness was a luxury she could not afford. She reminded Seraphine of herself, or of the self she was becoming, and the two women circled each other warily for the first month before something like respect, and then something like friendship took root between them. It was Ottoline who first saw what Seraphine truly was. It happened over a disputed shipment, a contract that another house was using to squeeze Rycroft toward ruin, and Ottoline had spread the papers across the table in despair, and Sarah had glanced at them for the length of 3 breaths, and then quietly pointed to a clause on the 3rd page that everyone else had missed, a clause that turned the entire dispute on its head. Ottoline had gone very still. Where did you learn to read a contract like that? I ran a pack, Seraphine said, before she could stop herself, and then, because the truth had already escaped, she let a little more of it out. I ran it for 11 years while a man wore the crown and took the credit. Then he decided my sister looked better in the role, and I decided I was finished being furniture. Ottoline looked at her for a long moment, and then she began to laugh, not cruelly, but with the sharp delight of a gambler who has just realized the card she drew from the bottom of the deck is worth a fortune. Furniture, she repeated. My girl, you are not furniture. You are the whole house. And from that day, Ottoline stopped treating her as a clerk and started treating her as a partner, drawing her into the true business of the house, the negotiations and the alliances, and the long, slow chess game of the river trade. And Seraphine learned faster than either of them had expected, because it turned out that the skills she had used to keep a mountain pack alive translated perfectly to keeping a trading house alive, and because for the first time in her life she was learning in a place where her competence was celebrated rather than quietly consumed. 6 months after she walked out of Blackmere Hold under the east wall, Seraphine Voss stood on the deck of a Rycroft barge as it came into the great trade port of Selvage, and she was not the same woman who had set a ring on a pillow in the dark. She stood straighter. She spoke less, and meant more. She had learned to wear plain clothes with an authority that made fine clothes look desperate. She had a partnership stake in a trading house that was, thanks in large part to her, no longer drowning but rising, buying up the debts of its rivals, extending its reach up and down the river and into the mountain trade routes. She had money that was entirely her own, earned with her own mind, tainted by nothing Kaelan had given her. And she had begun, very quietly and very patiently, to understand the true shape of the world she had walked into, a shape that had been invisible to her from behind the walls of Blackmere. Because the river trade, she had come to see, was not the free and open thing it appeared. It was being consolidated, slowly and with great subtlety, by a single hidden hand. Debts were being bought up across a dozen packs. Small houses were failing in patterns that were too neat to be chance. Contracts were being written with clauses that seemed generous, and turned out, 3 or 4 years down the line, to be nooses. Someone was building an empire out of paper, and doing it so patiently that almost no one had noticed, and the more Seraphine studied the patterns, the more a cold certainty grew in her that this hidden hand had already reached into the mountains, had already wrapped its fingers around the packs she knew. Had already, perhaps, found the alpha of Blackmere Hold, a proud and short-sighted man, newly obsessed with alliances he didn't fully understand, and offered him a beautiful bargain that he couldn't resist. The letters from Maeve confirmed it, arriving every few weeks by the healer's careful chain of travellers, written in the old woman's spidery hand. The picture they painted was exactly what Maeve had promised, a slow rot spreading through the hold. Lysandra had been crowned Luna at the solstice, with great ceremony, and for a season the pack had glowed with the novelty of her beauty, and then the novelty had curdled, because Lysandra, as it turned out, didn't know how the treaties worked. She didn't know which elder had blood feud with which family, or which supply routes could not be interrupted before the plague winter stores ran low, or how to look a grieving mother in the eye and mean the comfort she offered. She smiled, and the elders had melted, exactly as Kaelan had predicted. But a smile does not settle a border dispute, and a mirror cannot decide what a pack should do when 2 of its bloodlines demand the same grazing land in a dry year. The decisions that had once flowed invisibly from Seraphine's steady hands now piled up unmade on the Alpha's desk, and Kaelan, who had never learned to do them himself because he had never had to, began to drown in the small tended things he had never known he depended on. Maeve's letters catalogued it with the grim satisfaction of a woman watching a prophecy come true. The accounts, she wrote, no one can make sense of them. He brought in 3 clerks from the river, and they quarrel and produce numbers that do not agree. The Northern Treaty is fraying because the tribute payment was late twice, and no one remembered it was due at the old moon rather than the new, because that was a thing that lived only in Seraphine's head. The plague winter stores were not laid in properly this autumn, and if the fever comes again, there will be dying that there did not need to be. And Lysandra, Maeve wrote, Lysandra has begun to understand that she was given a crown and not a kingdom, that the crown is heavy, and the kingdom was never hers to keep. And she has grown frightened, and a frightened mirror shows only the fear back at the room. Seraphine read these letters in her small, clean room above the Rycroft counting house, and she waited for the satisfaction to come, the hot rush of vindication she had imagined in the birch wood. It did not come, or not in the shape she had expected. What came instead was a strange sorrow, because she had loved that pack, had loved the small, tended things for their own sake, and not only for the man who took credit for them, and it grieved her that people she cared about would suffer for Kaelin's short-sightedness. But grief, she had learned, could be a fuel like any other if you refused to let it become despair. She folded the letters away, and she went back to her work. And her work was very specific now, because she had begun to see how the hidden hand and the falling hold and her own carefully assembled knowledge might all fit together into a single shape. The hidden hand had a name, or at least a mask of one. It called itself the Meridian Concord, a lending consortium that presented a benign face, offering credit to struggling packs and houses on terms that seemed a mercy, and Seraphine had spent months quietly unwinding its true structure, following the threads of ownership through shell after shell until she was nearly certain who sat at the center of the web. The center was a wolf named Corvin Ashgrave, an old and patient predator who had spent 40 years converting the debts of others into a silent dominion, and who intended, she had come to believe, to own so much of both the river and the mountain trade that when he finally closed his fist, there would be no pack left independent enough to resist him. He did not want a crown. Crowns were for men like Kaelin, men who could be flattered and steered. Corvin wanted the ledgers behind every crown, and he was very close to having them. And this, Seraphine understood at last, was the true reason Kaelin had reached for the River Alliance. The Concord had come to him, she was certain of it now, had offered him beautiful terms and a marriage of trade between the mountain and the water, and had let him believe he was the one making the clever bargain. Lysandra's crowning had never been about a prettier Luna at all. It had been about a treaty, and the treaty had been dictated by Corvin Ashgrave, and Kaelin had discarded the one person in his pack who might have read the fine print and seen the noose in it. He had thrown away the only mind capable of protecting him from the man who intended to swallow him whole. It was almost, Seraphine thought, a kind of poetry. She took it to Otterline, because a game this large could not be played alone, and she laid it all out on the table one long night. The letters and the ledgers and the map of the Concord's holdings she had built thread by thread. Otterline listened without interrupting, her face growing graver by the hour, and when Seraphine finished, the older woman sat back and let out a long breath. "He's coming for us too," Otterline said. "Rycroft. We've been growing, and growth draws his eye. Sooner or later, he offers us his generous credit, and if we're weak enough to take it, we're already dead." She looked at Seraphine with something that was almost fear, and almost awe. You didn't just walk out of a bad marriage. You walked into the middle of a war, and you're the only one who's mapped the battlefield. "Then we don't take his credit," Seraphine said. "We do the opposite. We become the thing he can't swallow. We build a coalition of the houses and packs he hasn't caught yet. We pool our strength. We buy back the debts he's bought before he can close his fist, and we do it quietly, the way he did it, until one day he reaches out to close a deal and finds that the ground has moved under him." She spread her hands over the map. "He's spent 40 years being the only one who could see the whole board. We change that. We show the board to everyone who's been playing blind." It took another 5 months, and they were the hardest and most exhilarating months of Seraphine's life. She travelled the river under the plain name Sarah Rycroft, a partner now in truth and in the papers, and she sat across tables from wary merchant wolves and frightened minor alphas, and she showed them, one by one, the shape of the trap that was closing around all of them. She was not a persuader by charm. She had no charm to speak of, or rather, she had spent it all long ago on a man who took it for granted. What she had instead was clarity. The terrible clarity of someone who had read every relevant document and forgotten nothing. And clarity, she discovered, was more persuasive than charm to people who had spent their lives being charmed into ruin. She showed them the numbers. The numbers did not smile, and the numbers did not lie. And one by one, the houses and the packs came into the coalition, and the coalition began, very quietly, to buy. Word of it reached the mountains the way water finds a crack. Maeve's letters changed in tone, filling now with rumour from the trade caravans, whispers of a new power on the river, a house called Rycroft that had come from nowhere and was buying up debt faster than the Meridian Concord could, a coalition led by a woman no one had met, a woman with no title and no charm, and a memory like a ledger, who was said to have brought 3 of Corvin Ashgrave's captured packs back out of his grip in a single season. Maeve did not know, at first, that the woman was Seraphine. And then in one letter she did, because a trader who had passed through both worlds had described the coalition's silent partner, the plain woman who ran the accounts and remembered everyone's name, and Maeve had known in her bones who it was, and her next letter was smudged where the ink had run, and Seraphine understood the old woman had wept over it, and had written only one line at the bottom. I told you. The true thing. I told you. But the letter that changed everything came in the spring, a year and a half after the dawn under the east wall, and it was not from Maeve at all. It came through Otterline, who brought it to Seraphine's room with an expression Seraphine had never seen on her before, a careful, banked excitement. The Concord has requested a meeting, Otterline said, with the leadership of the coalition. They want to negotiate a truce, they say. Terms of mutual benefit. She held out the folded paper. But that's not the part you need to see. Read the delegation. Read who's coming. Seraphine took the letter and read it, and the world went very quiet and very still around her, the way it had once gone still in a dark hallway, with a tray in her hands. Because the Meridian Concord, it seemed, no longer negotiated directly. Corvin Ashgrave preferred to send proxies, packs, he had already captured and now used as his instruments, sending their alphas to do his bidding while he watched from behind the web. And the proxy the Concord had chosen to send to this negotiation, the captured pack sent to bargain with the coalition that had been bleeding the Concord all winter, was Blackmare Hold. The delegation would be led by the alpha of Blackmare and his Luna, by Kaelin, and by Lysandra. She set the letter down on the table with hands that didn't shake, and she was aware of Otterline watching her, aware that a lesser woman would have felt the hot flush of triumph or the cold clench of dread, and she waited to feel one or the other, and felt instead a vast and level calm, the calm of a river that has cut its channel so deep and so sure that nothing can turn it now. Kaelin was coming. Kaelin, who had called her a steward and not a Luna, who had never learned to read a contract because he'd had her to do it, was being sent by the man who now owned him to negotiate with a coalition he did not know she led, on terms he did not have the mind to understand. He was walking, blind and proud, into a room where the furniture he had discarded now held every card on the table. He doesn't know it's you, Otterline said quietly. The Concord doesn't know it's you. To them you're Sarah Rycroft. To him you're a woman who vanished a year and a half ago and was never worth chasing. She tilted her head. You could stay hidden. Send me to negotiate. Let him bargain with the coalition and never know whose knife is at his throat. That's the cold way, the clean way. Seraphine considered it. It would have been easy. It would have been safe. She could sit behind the curtain and let Otterline dismantle Black Mir's position and take back the packs and cripple the Concord, and Kaelin would return to the mountains defeated and confused, never knowing that the architect of his ruin was the woman who used to bring him tea. There was a version of vindication in that, the purest kind, the kind that never even lets the enemy know he was beaten by the one he wronged. But Seraphine had learned something in her 1.5 years of clarity, and it was this: mercy is only mercy when it is chosen out loud, and dominance that hides its face is only fear wearing a mask. She did not want to beat Kaelin from behind a curtain. She wanted him to see her. She wanted him to sit across a table and slowly understand, in the long, terrible silence, exactly what he had thrown away, and she wanted him to know that she had built all of it herself, from nothing he ever gave her. "No," she said. "I'll take the meeting. Set it here, in the great hall of the Port Authority. Formal. Witnesses from every house in the coalition. Let it be a room he can't walk out of and pretend it didn't happen." She looked up at Otterline, and something in her face made the older woman go still. He wanted iron. He's going to sit in a room full of it and understand that he chose to leave it behind. The days before the meeting stretched long and strange. Seraphine slept little, but not from anxiety. She had passed through anxiety long ago and come out the other side into something harder and more useful. She prepared. She assembled every document, every debt, every clause, the entire architecture of the Concord's overreach and Black Mir's captured position within it, and she built from it a case so complete and so clean that no amount of charm could argue with a single line of it. She was, after all, the woman who ran the accounts and remembered everything, and she had spent a lifetime being told that this made her a steward and not a queen, and she was about to demonstrate, in a formal hall before the leadership of the entire river trade, that a queen who cannot read the accounts is not a queen at all. She is only a mirror, and a mirror does not survive a room where the light is finally, mercilessly, turned on. The morning of the negotiation came grey and cool, with a river mist that clung to the great stone hall of the Selvage Port Authority and beaded on the tall windows. Seraphine dressed in plain dark clothes, well made but unadorned, the studied plainness that had become her armour. She wore no jewellery. She thought once, briefly, of the moonstone ring she had left on the pillow, and wondered whether it was still there, whether Kaelin had kept it, or thrown it away, or given it to Lysandra. And then she let the thought go, because it belonged to the woman she used to be, and that woman was not going to be in the room today. She pinned her hair back severely, and she looked at herself in the small glass, and she saw, at last, the iron he had said he wanted. It had been there all along. He simply had not known how to see it. The coalition took its places along the great table, the alphas and the house heads, and the merchant princes she had spent a year gathering, and they left the central seat empty for her. And there was a quiet deference in the room now that she had earned coin by coin and clause by clause. Otterline sat at her right hand. Beyond the tall doors she could hear the sounds of the Black Mir delegation arriving, the ring of boots on stone, the low murmur of a proud man who believed he was walking into a negotiation he could dominate. Seraphine sat with her hands folded on the polished wood, and she breathed slowly, and she felt the old bond stir faintly in her chest, the phantom ache of a thing that had never fully healed, and she let it ache because pain that has nowhere to go turns into information, and the information it gave her now was simple and clean. He is nothing to you anymore. He is only a man who made a mistake, and you are the room he must walk into. The doors opened. Kaelin came in first, as he always did, moving into a room as though it had been built to receive him, and he was still handsome and still broad-shouldered, and still wore his authority like a well-cut coat. But Seraphine saw at once what a year and a half had done to him. There was strain around his eyes that had not been there before, the strain of a man carrying weight he did not know how to carry, and there was something furtive underneath the confidence, the wariness of a proud creature who has begun to suspect he is not the hunter in his own story. Behind him came Lysandra, and the sight of her sister struck Seraphine harder than the sight of Calen, because Lysandra was still beautiful, still bright, but the brightness had gone brittle, like a lacquer over something cracked. She wore the Luna's circlet, and it sat on her brow like a burden rather than a crown, and she scanned the room of strangers with the anxious hunger of a woman who no longer knew whether she would be admired, and had never learned to be anything if she was not admired. They did not see her at first. That was the exquisite, terrible thing. Calen's eyes swept the coalition's faces, cataloguing the powers arrayed against him, sizing up the merchant princes and the minor alphas, and his gaze passed across Seraphine at the center of the table and moved on, because he was looking for a rival, for a rich old wolf like Corvin, for a man, and she was only a plain woman in dark clothes sitting very still. He was still looking for the enemy when the enemy was looking directly at him, and Seraphine let the moment stretch, let him settle into his chair and arrange his papers and clear his throat to begin, before she spoke, and when she spoke, her voice was low and even, and it cut through the great hall like the first crack in river ice. "Hello, Calen," she said. "You're late with the northern tribute again. It was due at the old moon." She watched it happen. She watched the words reach him a beat before his eyes did, watched his head come up and his gaze snap back to the center of the table and find her, truly find her, for the first time. She watched the confidence drain out of his face, the way blood drains from a wound, watched the color follow it, watched a year and a half of half-formed dread resolve all at once into a single impossible understanding. His mouth opened. No sound came out. Beside him, Lysandra had gone white to the lips, one hand rising to her throat, the circlet suddenly grotesque on her brow, and the two of them sat frozen in the long, ringing silence of a room full of witnesses, and Seraphine let the silence do its work, because she had learned that the wronged party should speak least and land hardest, and she had just landed with a single line, and she could afford now to wait. "Seraphine," Calen said at last, and her name came out of him, cracked and disbelieving, the name of a ghost. "You're—" He stopped. He looked at the coalition arrayed around her, at the deference in the room, at the empty center seat that was not empty at all, and she watched the full shape of it arrive in him, watched him understand that the coalition that had been bleeding his master all winter, the power that had summoned him here to bargain, was hers, that he had been sent by the man who owned him to beg terms from the woman he had discarded. "You lead them," he said. It was not a question. "You, the steward." "That's right," Seraphine said. "The steward. The one who remembers everyone's birthday." She let the ghost of his own words hang in the air, and she saw him recognize them, saw them land like the blow they were, and she saw Torvald, standing behind his alpha's chair, close his eyes briefly in something that might have been shame. "Sit down, Calen. You came to negotiate. Let's negotiate. But before you offer me the Concord's generous terms, you should understand who you're really working for, because I don't think you've ever read the contract you signed. You never did learn to read the fine print. That was always my job." She saw the flinch go through him. She rose from her seat, unhurried, and she came around the great table, and the whole room watched her, and she laid before Calen the first of her documents, the map of the Meridian Concord's holdings that she had built, thread by patient thread. "This is Corvin Ashgrave," she said, tapping the center of the web. "This is the man you actually bargained with, the man who came to you offering the River Alliance, the man who told you a prettier Luna would seal the deal. He let you believe you were being clever." She moved her finger outward along the threads to a knot of holdings deep in the mountains. "This is Blackmere. This is the debt the Conquered holds against your pack now, the debt you took on to fund the Alliance, the debt with the clause on the 4th page that lets him call it in whenever he chooses. He owns you, Kaelin. He has owned you since the day you signed. You didn't marry your sister into a River Alliance. You mortgaged your pack to a man who intends to swallow it, and you sent away the only person who could have read the paper and warned you." She straightened. "You wanted iron for your crown. You had it. You called it furniture and left it on a shelf." The silence. The silence in the great hall had weight now, a physical thing, and Kaelin sat inside it like a man who has just heard the ground begin to give way beneath a house he built with his own hands. He stared down at the documents she had laid before him, and his eyes moved across the numbers, and Seraphine watched him try to read them, watched him try to be, in this one desperate moment, the kind of man who could pass a contract and find its teeth, and watched him fail. He had never learned. He had never had to. He looked up at her, and there was something in his face now that she had not expected and had not prepared herself for, and it was not fury, and it was not pride. It was fear. Real fear. The fear of a man who has just understood how thoroughly he has been outplayed, and by whom. "How much of this is true?" he said, and his voice had lost its resonance, gone thin. It was not a challenge. It was a plea for it to be a lie. "All of it," Seraphine said. "Every line. You can have Otterline walk you through the accounts if you doubt me. But you won't doubt me, Kaelin, because in 11 years, I never once gave you a number that was wrong. That was the whole trouble, wasn't it? I was never wrong, and you got so used to it, you stopped noticing I was there at all." She let that sit. Then she moved to Lysandra, and her sister flinched as though she had raised a hand, though she had not. "Hello, Lys." Lysandra's mouth worked. The brittle brightness had shattered entirely now, and underneath it was only a frightened girl who had been handed a crown she never understood and had watched it slowly reveal itself as a trap. "Sarah, I didn't—" she started, and her voice broke. "I didn't ask for it. He gave it to me. I didn't know you'd heard. I didn't know you left because of—" She stopped. Tears stood in her eyes, and they were real, and Seraphine felt the old pull of them, the reflex of a lifetime of soothing her younger sister, of smoothing the way, of being the one who understood. She did not soothe her now, but she did not strike either. "I know you didn't ask," Seraphine said, and her voice was quieter, gentler, and somehow that gentleness was more terrible than anything sharp would have been. That's what he never understood about either of us. He thought he was choosing between two women. He was never choosing between us, Lys. He was choosing between a mirror and a mind. And he wanted the mirror because the mirror never asked him hard questions. And now the questions have come, and there's no one left in that hold who can answer them. And you've been sitting on a throne watching it rot around you, haven't you? You've known for a year that the crown was empty. I can see it on you. Lysandra's composure collapsed. She pressed both hands to her mouth, and the tears spilled over. And she nodded, a small broken movement, and the circlet on her brow caught the grey window light and looked, for a moment, exactly like what it was. A decoration on a woman who had been given the appearance of power and none of its substance. "I can't do it," she whispered. And it was not to Kaelin, and it was not to the room, it was to her sister, the only person who had ever truly seen her. I never could. Everyone kept waiting for me to know what to do, and I never knew. I only knew how to make them like me, and that stopped being enough the first winter. And I've been so afraid, Sarah. I've been so afraid every single day. Enough. Kaelin's voice cut across the hall, and there was a scrap of the old command in it, the reflex of authority, and he pushed himself up from his chair to his full height and turned it on Seraphine. Whatever this is, whatever you've built, you're still bound to Blackmere. The bond was never severed. You're my... He caught himself, but too late, and every wolf in the room heard the word he hadn't finished, and heard what it meant. He had come here as the alpha of a captured pack, sent to beg, and in his desperation he was reaching for the one claim he thought she could not deny, the claim he had never honored, the bond he had left unfinished for 11 years while he kept his options open. He was trying to command her home. Seraphine looked at him for a long moment, and then she laughed, a single low sound with no cruelty in it, and no warmth either. The humorless laugh of a woman who has finally seen the whole absurd shape of a thing. "That doesn't work on me anymore," she said. "You never claimed the bond, Kaelin. You kept it open on purpose, so you could weigh me, so you could decide whether I was worthy. Well, you decided. You decided I was a steward and not a Luna, and you gave the crown to my sister. And the moment you did that, the moment I heard you say it through the study door, the bond died on my side." I felt it snap. It hurt more than anything I have ever felt. And then it stopped hurting, and I understood that you had set me free without meaning to. She held his gaze, and she did not raise her voice. "You don't have a claim on me. You have a debt to a man named Corvin Ashgrave that will take your pack apart, and you have a coalition sitting in front of you that is the only thing standing between Blackmere and total ruin, and I am the person who leads it. So sit down, and stop reaching for a leash that isn't there, and let's talk about what happens now." He sat down. There was nothing else he could do, and the sitting down was its own kind of surrender, and the whole coalition watched a mountain king lower himself into a chair at the command of the woman he had called Furniture. Torvald, behind him, had opened his eyes again, and he was looking at Seraphine with an expression close to reverence, and later she would learn that Torvald had argued against her dismissal that night in the study, had been the uneasy voice she'd half heard, and that he had never forgiven himself for not doing more. But that was later. Now there was only the negotiation, and the negotiation was the checkmate she had spent 1.5 years building, and she laid it out with the clean patience of a woman who had all the time in the world, because time was the one thing she had learned to master. "Here is what happens," Seraphine said. "The coalition buys your debt from the Meridian Concord. We're in a position to do it. We've been buying Corvin's paper all winter, and he's overextended, and he doesn't know yet how badly, because he's used to being the only one who can see the board, and I've spent 1 year showing the board to everyone else. When the coalition holds Blackmere's debt instead of the Concord, Corvin loses his grip on the mountain, and that's the last piece he needs to close his fist on the whole trade, so losing it breaks his back. He'll have to come to the table himself after that, no more proxies, and when he does, he'll find that the ground has moved under him exactly the way he spent 40 years moving it under everyone else." She paused. "Blackmere will be free of the Concord, but it will owe the coalition instead, and the coalition's terms are different from Corvin's. We don't want to own you. We want the debt repaid honestly over a fair span of years, and we want the mountain trade routes open, and we want Blackmere run by someone who can actually read a treaty, She let that land. Which brings us to the crown. The word hung in the air. Kaelin's head came up. You mortgaged your pack because you couldn't tell a generous offer from a noose, Seraphine went on. You will not be trusted to run it out of debt. That's not vindication, Kaelin, that's arithmetic. A pack this deep in the hole needs a steward at the head of it. Someone who understands the accounts and the treaties and the small tended things. Someone who can look a grieving mother in the eye and mean it. Someone the elders will follow, not because she photographs like a queen, but because she keeps them alive through the plague winters. Blackmere needs a Luna. A real one. She looked, deliberately, at neither Kaelin nor Lysandra, but out at the coalition, at the witnesses, letting the shape of it become undeniable in the room before she said it. And there's exactly one person in this hall who has ever actually done that job. She did not say it was her. She did not have to. The room understood, and Kaelin understood, and the understanding broke over his face like a slow dawn of the most bitter kind, because he saw now the whole staggering symmetry of it. He had told a war second in a dark study that Seraphine was a steward and not a Luna, and he had given the crown to her sister to seal a bargain he did not understand, and every single consequence of that one choice had flowed downhill to this exact moment, this room, in which the only path to save his pack was to hand the true authority back to the woman he had discarded, on her terms, in front of every power on the river. He had built the gallows. She had bought the lumber, and now he sat beneath it and understood. You'd come back, he said, and there was something raw in it. Something that in another man Seraphine might have mistaken for love, but which she recognized now as the grief of a man mourning not her but himself, mourning the version of his life in which he hadn't thrown away the one thing that held it all together. You'd take the crown. No, Seraphine said, and she watched the confusion cross his face. I wouldn't take your crown, Kaelin. I have my own house now. I have a partnership in Rycroft. I have a coalition that trusts me. I have a life I built from nothing you gave me, and I am not going to leave it to come and clean up a mountain for a man who called me furniture. I told you I was finished being furniture, and I meant it. She turned then, at last, to her sister. But Lysandra could learn, if she wanted to. She has the thing that can't be taught, the thing that made the elders melt, and she never had anyone to teach her the rest, because the person who could have taught her was busy being told she was only a steward. I would teach her. Not from Blackmere. From here. She'd come to me, and she'd learn the accounts and the treaties and the small tended things, and she'd go back and be the Luna the crown actually needs, and this time she'd earn it, and this time it would be hers. She looked at Lysandra, whose tears had stopped, whose face had gone very still with a wild and fragile hope. That's the offer, Lys. Not a crown handed to you. A crown you'd have to build yourself. It's harder. It's the only kind that's real. Do you want it? Lysandra looked at her sister across the great table, across a year and a half and a lifetime, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with Kaelin at all. The old fierce love of two girls who had grown up in the same shadow, one of them praised for her face, and one of them relied upon for her mind, both of them, in their different ways, never quite seen. Yes, Lysandra said, and her voice did not break this time. Yes, teach me. Kaelin sat between them, forgotten for a moment, a man watching two women decide the future of his pack without him, and he understood that this was the true shape of his humbling. Not that he was ruined, but that he was irrelevant, that the story had moved past him, that the small tended things he had never noticed were the whole kingdom, and the crown had only ever been the decoration on top. He would remain alpha in name, because the pack needed continuity, and the coalition needed the debt repaid, and there was no mercy in publicly stripping a man of everything in front of witnesses who would carry the tale up and down the river. But everyone in the hall knew that from this day forward, Blackmere Hold would be run by a Luna who reported, quietly, to the woman at the center of the table, and that the woman at the center of the table was the one he had left on a pillow in the shape of a silver ring. And it was Kaelin in the end who took the ring out of his coat. Seraphine watched him do it, watched him draw out the small, heavy band of northern silver with its moonstone, and she understood that he had carried it for a year and a half, that he had kept it, that some part of the proud, short-sighted man had known, even as she walked out the east wall, that he had thrown away the true thing. He set it on the table between them, the way she had set it on the pillow, and it was the only thing he had left to say that he had not been able to say in words. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's too late and it's worthless, and I know it. But I am. You were the whole kingdom. I called it furniture. I'll spend the rest of my life understanding what that cost me." Seraphine looked at the ring. She did not pick it up. She had left it once as a message. I know. I heard. I am gone. And it had said everything. And it had done its work. And she had no need of it now. But she did not sweep it away either. Did not grind his apology under her heel, because she had learned that mercy is only mercy when it is chosen out loud, and dominance that gloats is only fear wearing a crown. "Keep it," she said. "Not for me. As a reminder. Every time the accounts don't balance, and you reach for someone who can read them, look at that ring and remember that you had the best there was, and you couldn't see her. That's not cruelty, Kaelin. That's the most useful thing I can give you. A man who never forgets his one great mistake doesn't make it twice." She rose from the table, and the coalition rose with her, and the negotiation was over, because there was nothing left to negotiate. She had given him his pack's survival, his sister a real crown, and himself the one lesson that might make the rest of his life mean something, and she had taken back nothing but her own freedom, which had never been his to give. Corvin Ashgrave came to the table himself 3 weeks later, an old and patient predator forced at last into the open by the collapse of the mountain grip he had thought secure, and Seraphine faced him across a smaller table with less ceremony and more danger, because he was the greater antagonist, the one who had played the longer game, and he did not fear her the way Kaelin had learned to. But that is a story of its own, of ledgers unwound and shells cracked open and 40 years of silent dominion undone by a woman who had learned to read the fine print in a mountain hold and never forgot a single line of it. And it ended, as her stories tended to, not with a chaotic victory, but with a quiet one, with Corvin signing a settlement across a table because the arithmetic left him no other move, and understanding as he signed that he had been beaten by the one variable he had never accounted for, a discarded steward with a memory like a ledger and nothing left to lose. Lysandra came to the river that summer and stayed a year, and she learned, and it was hard, and there were nights she wept with the difficulty of it, and Seraphine did not soften the lessons, because she loved her sister enough now to let her struggle. And when Lysandra went back to the mountain, she went back different, went back with the accounts in her head, and the treaties at her fingertips, and the small tended things understood at last, and she became, in time, exactly the Luna the crown had always needed, and the elders who had once melted at her smile came to rely on her judgment, and that reliance was worth 1,000 smiles, and she knew it, and she had earned it, and it was hers. Maeve Ordain lived to see it, the old healer who had pressed an iron key into a girl's cold hand in the dark, and in her last letter, in her spidery hand, she wrote only, "The true thing came home. It came home stronger than it left. I always knew." Seraphine read it in her rooms above the counting house that were no longer small in a life that was entirely her own, and she thought about worth and where it comes from and who is allowed to grant it. Because that was the lesson underneath all of it, the thing she had walked out the east wall to learn. Worth is not a crown handed down by someone in power who has decided you are enough. It is not given at all. It is proven in the dark, in the accounts no one thanks you for, in the small tended things and the fine print and the debts you refuse to take. And when someone in power looks at all of that and calls it furniture, the answer is not to scream and not to beg, but to rise before dawn and go and become iron somewhere they cannot reach, and to build, and to wait, and to let them come to you at last, holding a ring, having finally understood. Loyalty cannot be bought, a crown cannot make a Luna, and the person who runs the accounts and remembers everyone's birthday is not the steward of the kingdom. She is the kingdom. They just never knew it until she was gone.